Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Michael McTeer, and this is Murder in Michigan. John Norman Collins. In July of 1967, a young man driving a grayish-blue Chevrolet approached a young woman walking home to her apartment after a long day of classes at a local university. The man would stop to talk to the woman several times, and each time the woman would shun his advances. She finally walked away, and the car drove off. The naked body of 19-year-old Eastern Michigan University student Mary Therese Flazer, an accounting major, would be found 1 month later. Discovered on an abandoned farm by two teenage boys, the badly decomposed body would be identified by dental records. Flazer had been badly beaten and mutilated. The coroner noted 30 stab wounds, that her feet had been severed above the ankle, that several fingers were missing, and that one arm had been severed from the body. Police also suspected that she had been raped, but the body was too badly decomposed to determine that. An interesting and important note about the body was that it had been moved around the farm 3 times. This meant that the killer had returned at least twice. Another clue came when a young, dark-haired man driving a grayish-blue Chevrolet appeared at the funeral home 2 days before the services. He requested to take a picture of the corpse, indicating it was for the parents. He was denied and left, but the receptionist noticed the man was not carrying a camera. June 1968. A young woman from Ypsilanti who was waiting for a bus that would take her to see her boyfriend in Ann Arbor informed her roommate that she was going to hitchhike. Her roommate cautioned her, but she was convinced she had missed the late bus. A red and black car containing 3 young men was seen offering her a ride. Reluctantly, she accepted. She promised to call her roommate when she reached Ann Arbor, but no call would ever come. The body of 20-year-old art student Joanne Elspeth Schell would be found 2 months later. Strangely, the body was only partially decomposed. They concluded that the body had been partially covered, but that the top half had been exposed to room temperatures. It was also obvious that the body had been moved there in the last 24 hours. Schell had been raped, stabbed 25 times, and had her throat slit. Her miniskirt was tied around her neck, and a wound behind her ear had fractured her skull. The police similarities to the attack of Mary Flazer to believe they had a serial killer on their hands. In interviews, 2 witnesses reported seeing the young lady walking down the street with the same young man who had been driving the red and black car. Although neither witness was completely sure, they independently picked out the same suspect. When questioned by police, the young man, John Norman Collins, denied knowing Schell. He also insisted that he had been at his mother's in Centerline, Michigan, and that he had not returned to Ypsilanti until after the abduction had taken place. The police took him at his word and never checked the alibi. March 1969. 23-year-old University of Michigan law student Jane Louise Mixer would post a note on a college bulletin board seeking a ride to her hometown, Muskegon, Michigan. She was going home to tell her family she was getting married and moving to New York. She would not make it. Mixer's fully clothed body would be found covered with her own raincoat. She had been shot twice in the head, and a stocking had been tied around her throat. Her body was found on top of a grave site, but that was not where she was killed. It was also noted that she had not been sexually assaulted. Despite having few similarities to the previous killings, the garment around her neck and the proximity of the murder, the police tentatively tied the case to the serial killer. 4 days later. Only days after Mixer's body was discovered, a surveyor came across the mutilated body of a teenager disposed of in a rural area only a few hundred yards from where Schell's body had been found. 16-year-old Romulus High School student Marilyn Skelton had disappeared while hitchhiking only 2 days prior. She had last been seen outside a drive-in restaurant located in a nearby neighborhood. Since Skelton was not a student and was a known drug user-dealer, along with the fact that she was also a police informant, led many to disassociate her killing with the serial killer. But the fact that her garter belt had been tied around her neck and that she was naked led the chief of police to lump her in with the prior killings. With the public becoming more demanding for an arrest, police departments from 5 local communities joined together to form a task force, but little would come of it. April 1969. On a warm spring day, 13-year-old Dawn Louise Basom, escorted by her close friend Earl Kidd, headed home from a friend's house. 5 blocks from home, Kidd would say goodbye to Basom. She proceeded to take a shortcut along a set of railroad tracks that would take her to her home. She would never make it. Basom's body would be found in the open and had been placed there to be easily found. She had been stabbed and strangled. Although she had not been raped, her bra had been tied around her neck. A handkerchief was also found stuffed in her mouth, presumably to muffle her screams. Investigators found several items of Basom's clothing in a nearby barn, as well as fresh blood. Returning a week later, a scrap of her clothing and an earring belonging to Skelton was also found in the nearby barn. They had been placed there on purpose by the killer. He was taunting them, and they knew it. Shortly thereafter, the barn itself was set ablaze by an unknown person. Laying across the drive to the barn were 5 lilacs, each carefully placed as if to represent the 5 victims. June 1969. Alice Elizabeth Callum, a 21-year-old University of Michigan graduate student who would be last seen on June 8th, shortly after midnight, while walking home from a friend's birthday party, Callum would be abducted. The next day, 3 teenage boys discovered Callum's body in a field. She had been raped, stabbed, and shot in the head. However, she had not been killed there, and police suspected she was placed there to be easily found. Blood evidence would link her murder to a local gravel pit. The last victim. 18-year-old Karen Sue Bynum, an Eastern Michigan University student, would leave her apartment around noon to purchase a wig. When curfew hit and she had not returned, her roommates reported her missing. Bynum's body would be found naked and lying face down in a roadside gully. She had been severely beaten, raped, burned with acid, and strangled to death. Realizing the attacker often returned to the scene, the police decided to set a trap. The news of the final victim was not released to the press, and a mannequin was put in place of the body. Their hopes that the killer would return were fulfilled. The next morning, under the cover of torrential rain, undercover officers observed a young man running from the gully. They had not seen him arrive. However, attempts to radio responding officers proved futile as the storm created a signal interference and the man disappeared. Triumph. Bynum arrived at the wig shop and purchased a $20 piece. She asked the shop owner to look at a man sitting on a motorcycle outside the shop. Bynum quipped she had made 2 foolish errors in her life, buying a wig and hitching a ride with a stranger. The shop owner quoted her as saying, "I've got to be either the bravest or the dumbest girl alive, because I've just accepted a ride from this guy." She left the store, hopped on the motorcycle, and they drove away. The shop owner would describe the young man's clothing and his dark hair. She would also identify the motorcycle. She would get the make and model incorrect. Upon talking to a nearby store owner, they learned that it was a blue Triumph and not the Honda the original shop owner identified. As it would happen, a patrolman who had been a frat brother with John Norman Collins recognized the description of the rider and the cycle. The officer had himself seen Collins riding on his Triumph the day of the disappearance. Collins admitted to being on campus that day, claiming he was there to visit an old girlfriend. Several of Collins, upon questioning, the original girlfriend provided the police with photographs of Collins that were presented to the shop owner. The owner and the clerk were both adamant that Collins was the man accompanying Bynum that day on the motorcycle. Digging deep. Several of Collins' former girlfriends described his explosive anger, and frat brothers said that he had talked about raping women. Upon questioning co-workers, they learned that Collins gave details on the killings, claiming he got them from an uncle on the police force. The details described by his co-workers provided information that had not been made public, and the uncle, under questioning, revealed that he had never told Collins anything about the murders. Detectives also established that either Collins knew the victims or lived close enough to their residences that it was likely he would have known them. Authorities would also find 3 women who would have testified that Collins had tried to entice each of them onto his motorcycle the same day Beineman went missing. The uncle would also disclose to the police that he and his family had been out of town and that Collins had access to the house to take care of the pets. A search of the home's basement produced hair and blood samples linked to the victims. An additional victim, not from Michigan, would also be tied to Collins. 17-year-old Roxy Ann Phillips' naked body was discovered on July 13th in California. She had been beaten and strangled to death. Additionally, the belt that had held her dress was found wrapped around her neck. Collins had been vacationing in California at the time, and evidence from his rented trailer tied him to her death. Collins would be formally arraigned for the murder of Karen Sue Beineman on August 1, 1969. A suggestion by Collins' lawyer that he claimed diminished capacity was rejected by Collins' mother, and the trial was set to begin on June 1970. The trial would be a contentious one, with both sides presenting multiple witnesses. Before the jury departed for deliberation, the judge instructed them that there were only 2 possible outcomes. Neither Collins was guilty for first-degree murder or not guilty. There would be no reduction in the charge. August 19, 1970, John Norman Collins was found guilty of first-degree murder in the case of Karen Sue Beineman. He would be sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. Collins would appeal multiple times, and he would lose multiple times. Although some parts of admitted evidence were found to be inadmissible, the Court of Appeals concluded that they were merely supportive and not sufficient to require a new trial. It was also during this time that John Norman Collins would change his name. Taking his father's surname, he would become John Norman Chapman, but he couldn't change what he had done. California would eventually waive their right to extradite Collins. They argued since he would already spend life in prison without the chance of parole in Michigan, there was no point in trying him in California. Although Collins would never be tried for the murders of Flazer, Shell, Skelton, Basom, Callum, and Phillips, evidence tied each killing to Collins. In addition to the physical evidence, both his roommate and several acquaintances provided statements connecting Collins to the victims. The murder of Jane Mixer, once tied to Collins, would later be attributed to 60-year-old former nurse Gary Earl Lederman. DNA evidence linked Lederman to Mixer, although he had never been suspected in that killing. Collins would be moved multiple times and at one point was scheduled to be sent to Canada for incarceration, as he was a dual citizen of the U.S. and Canada. However, under extreme public pressure, the order to send Collins to Canada was eventually rescinded. Collins would quickly develop a reputation as a problem inmate and on numerous occasions would attempt to escape. Eventually, Collins landed at the G. Robert Cotton Correctional Facility in Michigan. To this day, Collins insists that he was innocent. He has his supporters, including his family, that adamantly deny his guilt and the many women he corresponds with on the outside. The Michigan murderer, co-ed killer, Ypsilanti Ripper, is currently 76 years old. Reflection. After the killing of Shell, Collins' second victim, the police questioned him as a suspect. Collins provided an alibi, claiming to have been at his parents' home in Centerline. No one questioned it, and they never confirmed it. Had they, maybe the remaining victims would still be alive today. But who knows? Until next time, this is Michael McTeer for Murder in Michigan. Good night, everyone, and stay safe.